So today is October 18th, 2021. My name is Ann Shi. I'm with the Houston Asian American Archive. Today we're interviewing Mr. Gary Shim. How are you, Mr. Shim?
I'm good. Good. Good evening to you, or good morning to you, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking this interview with us. To start, can you tell us when and where were you born?
I'm actually a native Houstonian. I was born in Houston, Texas, here in the U.S. on August 9th, 1963. So I'm born and reared here in Houston. To some degree, my family and some of my friends tell me that I'm actually pretty boring. I did not go to college outside of Houston. I went to Rice University, and then of course my job and career and my marriage, everything, my family has kept me here within the city of Houston. Although I live in Sugar Land now, that's where me and my wife and my family lives in the southwest part of the greater Houston area.
Can you describe the what Houston was like during your childhood?
Oh wow. I think, of course, I didn't keep up with the news when I was growing up, but I think in the areas in which I grew up, particularly, we moved to a different part of the city when I was, let's see, eighth grade. So that's what, 12, no, 14 years old. So where I came from and grew up in my childhood, if you will, up to that point, was predominantly Caucasian, white America. We had some African Americans and some Hispanics, but in the area I lived, but it wasn't near as much as it is today, where the city of Houston is much more diverse. When I moved, when I was in eighth grade, similarly, the area that I lived in was predominantly white or Caucasian. We did have, of course, minorities. There actually were a lot more Asians, Far East Asians, if you will, in the neighborhood. I lived in Alief. That's the part of town that I lived in when I was going to middle school and, of course, high school. So there was a definitely higher concentration of Asians at the time. So that was a little bit of adjustment for me, more so in a positive direction, getting and seeing people that I could potentially relate to culturally was definitely a change for me. But yeah, so Houston, as we know, is very diverse today, very much a melting pot. But in my experience growing up, it wasn't that much that I could see based on, the exposure that I had.
And what were some of your earliest childhood memories?
Well, my family, my parents, and I guess I could characterize it, particularly my father and his side of the family, very traditional Chinese in a sense. We had a grocery store, a family-owned business, and he spent, gosh, 7 days a week there, and 14, 16 hours a day he spent there at the business. My mother, school teacher, public school teacher in Houston Independent School District. So she was doing that job up until high school for me. And then she retired and went into private teaching, if you will, with other school districts, or not really school districts, but the parochial schools. My memories in that regard was because my parents worked so long and so frequent in terms of the number of days. Because my mother, even though she taught school, she'd work 12, 14-hour days as well, staying at school, helping out her students, catching up on gradings and things like that. I was very much a latchkey child growing up. I don't know if you're familiar with what that term means. So I would go to school, then I would ride the bus home, public bus, coming home, and then latch the door, if you will. And that's how I would spend most of my time. That's why for me, when I was growing up in elementary school, through middle school, I really didn't have any circle of friends growing up. I had friends at school, but when you would go to somebody's house or have a hangout in the afternoon or play around, I was not able to experience that as a child. That's one thing that as my child is very much to myself. That's why now, as an adult, many people feel that there are times when I tend to want to isolate myself or be alone, because that's just the way I've grown up and the way that I'm used to it. So for me, that's something that is the lifestyle that I've geared toward. And so that's somewhat maybe unique for me. I don't know, but definitely me and how I grew up. Definitely a latchkey child. So I used to always say TV was my best friend back then at times, because that's all I had to do for entertainment value after we were done with schoolwork and such.
Do you mind sharing some of the TV programs that you were watching
Oh,
back then?
TV programs. Well, I'm trying to remember, of course, cartoons. Growing up for sure. watching. And of course, when I was growing up, English was the language spoken in my home. So it wasn't like I watched TV for the purpose of learning English. My parents were very much of the philosophy. My mother was a school teacher, so she very much at that time the I guess the thought process was do not teach your kids multiple languages because they'll get confused or they'll be have difficulty differentiating between the two. As we know now, actually, the sooner you teach children bilingual or trilingual, multiple languages, even from birth, that is the time to do it. Don't wait because it gets harder as you get older. And so for me, speaking English at home ever since I can remember growing up, I didn't watch TV for the sake of language, if you will. So it was mainly cartoons, a few sitcoms here and there, and that's kind of what it. And again, we didn't have cable back then when I was growing up in elementary school, so there wasn't a lot of choice, right? So those are the programs that I guess kind of stick out of my mind that I watched as I was growing up after school.
It's wonderful to hear. And can you tell us a little bit about how your earlier generation came to Houston or came to US to begin with?
So from my father's side, my father was also born here in Houston. He was born in 1931. His mother was quite young when she married my grandfather or my father's father. It was culturally, it's kind of the way where he went back to China, found a young wife, brought her back over here to the US. I think there's probably, I'm going to say 40 to 50 years difference in age between my grandfather and my grandmother. And of course, my dad had a difficult childhood because of the time he grew up. And during the height of the Depression era is when my father grew up. So it was really hard for him and his siblings. He's the fifth out of 7 siblings. So when we talk about what he went through, it was quite difficult. And I think a lot of what I see as I grew up and some of the values that he had, the way he conducted his life was probably a result of some of that difficulty that he went through growing up. And so, he did not get a full college education. He got a high school diploma, but, he knew the importance of education, which is why he really drove me and my sister, very hard to get a good education and to make sure that we had that solid foundation and baseline. And that's one of the ideals and I guess, values that's been ingrained in me. And certainly I've passed that on to my children as well. My mother, on the other hand, she certainly didn't come from a wealthy family. They were, middle class, growing up. Her parents came from very prominent families within the city of Houston. And part of the Chow Center, you guys probably know Dr. Edward Chen. That's my uncle. That's on my mother's side. That's my uncle's brother. So I don't need to go into all the details of what he comes through in his background, but very prominent. And he's very proud of his heritage, as am I. I'm very thankful for the groundwork they laid. So, because I know my grandfather, which is my uncle's father, my mother's father, was very active in the community, in the Chinese community. He served in the U.S. government. Well, he served in the FBI, did a lot of things there relative to translations and teaching some of the FBI and CIA agent Chinese during the time of Cold War. And so, I was very, very proud of some of the things that he did. Not that it brought us a lot of notoriety, but it's something that I know that, because of some of the groundwork he laid, I think some of the Chinese in Houston, as well as my family, were able to, reap some of that benefit. So those kind of the early generations, in my family history.
Great, thank you for sharing. And you mentioned that one of the key family values was around education. Can you talk a little bit more about what other family values that your parents instilled you with?
Yeah, education certainly sticks out. I think family, nuclear family especially, but and to some extent certainly extended family. Again, my father had 6 siblings, and of course they had kids. They're all married. They had kids, and some of their kids have kids right at the time I was growing up. Even though I was number 5, or my dad was number 5 out of 7, most of my cousins were actually quite much older than I am. But independent of that, one of the memories that I take from my childhood is, all the major holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's, Easter, July 4th, we would always get together for extended family gatherings, a time to catch up, see how everybody's doing, spend time with relatives, if you will. And that's how I remember and getting to know my cousins and my aunts and uncles on a more deeper level than just very casual. So I think the sense of family, the sense of remembering your family, protecting, being loyal to your family, very much a value that comes through. I think also typically besides education, of course, is the understanding the value of money. Certainly understanding what it means, and I attribute that to the time frame in which my father and my mother grew up. During the Depression era, money obviously was very, very precious at the time. And so understanding the value of a dollar, if you will, and the value of hard work to get to where you've gotten to so far and what you want to get to in terms of your goals. So I think almost to a fault sometimes in terms of being too miserly, if you will. But I think that's some of the values that were passed on to me, certainly in regards to education, the importance of family and looking out for each other. And of course, the value of taking care of your money and being wise in your investments.
Did you grow up with any spirituality in your family?
I did not start myself going to church until I was in, I want to say sixth or seventh grade. My mother and father both actually were members of the same church that I ended up going to, which I still attend today, Chinese Baptist Church. So we're Baptist, Protestant denomination. Chinese Baptist Church is the oldest Chinese church here in Houston. Let's see, the church began its life, if you will, in 1953. So it's almost 70 years old, if you will. It's the first Chinese church. It's not the largest in town anymore, but it's the oldest, certainly. My parents did not go to church on a regular basis. Part of the upbringing that they had was going to church. It was a way to interact and be social with other Chinese. It really wasn't so much for the spiritual aspect of it. And they joined the church because their parents told them to join the church, as part of being part of the church community. But as they grew up, of course, I don't think they really understood what it meant to be a real church member in terms of all the theology and doctrine behind it. So I didn't really start going until 6th, 7th grade, middle school. And it was mainly, honestly, my mother wanted me to go predominantly for the social aspect, right? She wanted me to, because she knew that I lived a very sheltered life as a child. So she wanted me to be able to spend time and be exposed to people of the Chinese culture and people that are, quote, like me, unquote, right? And so that's what I did. I actually became a member in high school, and and of course, my wife and I, we both attended there. I'm actually a deacon at the church now. I've been there for 20 some odd years being a deacon. My kids were really born and grew up in the church. So we're very involved in our church right now. So despite, I guess, my parents' lack of real encouragement, if you will, in attending church, that's where I've ended up plugging in and integrating into that religious type of environment.
Did you observe as some of the challenges of assimilation from your parents' end?
When you say assimilation, you mean?
Trying to become part of, trying to be American, I guess.
Actually, it wasn't as difficult or challenging as some of my friends, like who were first gen, because my parents both, again, were born here in Houston. They were probably more American than, a lot of people who are Caucasian. In fact, before the technology is as it is today with Zoom and Microsoft Teams and very video centric, if you will, graphically intense, when we do business on the phone, or when I would go to meetings on the phone back in my early days of my career, and then a person would actually see me in person later, they would remark many times, I'm nothing in person, like they would envision just listening to my voice. Because when you hear me, you probably notice there's no accent whatsoever. In fact, if any accent that I have is going to be Southern accent, a Texan accent. My parents are the exact same way. There is literally no Asian or Chinese accent whatsoever. And that's how they grew up. And so that's how me and my sister grew up. So, in terms of difficulty assimilating, language-wise, it was nothing. It was no issue whatsoever. And if it wasn't for the ethnic, color of my skin, et cetera, there really would have been no difficulty in assimilating into culture. There were times, certainly there was racism, discrimination that I had to go through in school. Because remember, I went to predominantly white schools. So having somebody that's different from them, certainly it was part of, I had to endure. But honestly, it wasn't as severe as probably in some other cases, that I've seen and heard. My girls, one of the reasons we decided to settle in Sugar Land is Sugar Land has a very diverse population, a lot of Asian, and Asian, I mean, not just Far East Asian, but India, people from India and from the other nations in that region. And so there's so many diverse ethnicities that my girls were able to be exposed to many different cultures, many different types of people, if you will, ethnicities, and I think that bodes well for them as they became adults, and of course finishing up their college education, deciding what they want to do for careers. So they have not had difficulty assimilating into the American or the Western culture. Now that being said, both of them, I found it interesting that even with the diverse set of friends that they have, predominantly they gravitated towards spending more time with Chinese and Asians. That's just the way it played out for them, which is fine. I didn't have an issue with that, but they did have Caucasian friends. They did have African American friends too. So, I'm very pleased that they have developed a very diverse understanding of culture. For me, assimilation, diet, food, we very much American. We Chinese as well, but food, the holidays, very much, American, Christmas, Thanksgiving, July 4th. There were things that we would do to celebrate Chinese culture too, like Chinese New Year. We do something for that, and 10/10, we'd recognize that. The New Moon Festival, we do some of that, but it wasn't near like I work for HP, of course, and I have people that work for me in Taiwan, and we interface with people in China all the time as part of our job. The things that my family did in terms of recognizing those cultural events, nowhere near what my family did. We were much less and more subdued about it because my family was so Americanized. My immediate parents and even my grandparents, to some degree, especially my mother's side. My grandfather, of course, worked for the government, so he's very much in tune with that. And so, for me, assimilation really wasn't that difficult, I think, and it's probably due just to the fact that the number of generations down from where I am relative to when the first gen immigrated over from China. So
Yeah, it's definitely most interesting to see how culture get preserved and onwards.
sure.
Could you share a little bit about what are some of those culture or heritage that you and your grandparents say, and your great grandparents, and how some of the say like culture traits get carried on in your family?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of things come to mind because of my church, right? We still have a number of senior citizens that very much are first gen, or at the very least, came over many, many, many years ago, right? And so a lot of what the culture, if you will, the traditions of Chinese, definitely are very pervasive in my church. So I see and still experience some of the things they go through. Whereas to me, it doesn't have a lot of meaning, or we don't ascribe to it. As an example, when a child is born, okay, there is this event or tradition that goes on usually 30 days after. It kind of varies on the time, but it's a red egg party, where they have an event to celebrate the birth of a child. Traditionally, it's way back when, historically, they had this event to celebrate that the child has survived this point, because back then healthcare wasn't very good, and so infant mortality was very high. So that was the tradition as it carried on. An egg, of course, being a symbol of prosperity and being able to grow and the start of a birth, egg, right? So that's kind of carried over, obviously, as people came over here. I didn't really know the story until much later in life about how that played out. My parents didn't do that for me. I certainly did not do that for my girls, my daughters growing up. But still, I understand it and I know what it's about. And so, I can have an appreciation for it. Similarly, on the other side, on death, things that happen that the Chinese people do in terms of, I don't know if I use the word superstition, but there are things that they will not do before a certain time period after somebody passes, or certain traditions that they do when a person dies and during the funeral. Even for people who are not, or even for people who are churchgoers, I think some of that tradition and culture is so ingrained, even though they don't believe in it, if you will, in terms of the spiritual, supernatural power of doing it or the repercussions of not doing it, they still follow through because that's how they grew up, right? That's what they knew. Things like that. Eating certain foods, particularly at New Year's. You always got to eat noodles, right? So the symbol of long life and prosperity. Those are the things. Even my wife still gets on me today on some of the things. She's a very devout, Christian, and we're very involved in our church, of course, both of us. But chopsticks, when you eat noodles or when you're eating your food, it is bad luck to leave your chopsticks standing up in the bowl, right? I mean, I never knew that until she caught me one time. And just even my mother-in-law, very very Christian woman, loving woman in that regard. She still has some of that come to her, and she always gives us a stern look when saying, "Oh, you can't be doing that, bad luck." Like, so even now, as westernized as she is, and my wife and my mother-in-law, I think there's still some of that culture, I think, and tradition that's just ingrained that comes through, with us in that regard. So things like that. It's always to some degree interesting to try to marry the two, if you will, maintaining a connection to your Chinese culture and some of the traditions, and then of course, the American way as well. Like the Chinese zodiac, right? That I get a kick out of, listening to the conversations. Oh, you were born in the year of the dog. You're born in the year of the pig. So that's why you're the way you are, all that stuff, right? And so, obviously in the American culture, you have the horoscope, right? So you can contribute some of the same things. But I just find it very interesting and educational sometimes to hear, sitting down with some of the older ladies, the aunties, right? That I can communicate with, speak English, because I'm not fluent in Chinese, right? You can probably tell that. But they share with me some of the stories. So it's kind of cool to hear some of that.
So you don't speak Chinese, but do you understand Chinese or?
一点点. Really very very little. It's only really the things I understand are some of the very basic things, like how to say goodbye, how to say hello, things like that. My daughters actually or have taken Chinese in school. My oldest daughter, actually, she's in grad school at Rice, as you may or may know, Kelsey, and she's taking second year Chinese on the college level. So there are things that actually my wife, who's fluent in Chinese, speaks Mandarin, speaks Taiwanese, is actually at times having challenges helping Kelsey with it, because some of the more subtle grammar things, some of the more complex literature, if you will, is things that sometimes my wife has challenges with, and of course then my mother-in-law sometimes steps in to help as well. But no, unfortunately, I can't read or write fluently or with any kind of proficiency. That's the one regret I have growing up. As I told you, my parents, particularly my mother, who's in the educational field, the philosophy back then is don't confuse your children, right? So we only spoke and talked and wrote English when I was growing up. I did go to Chinese school for a time, but that was only on a Saturday for 1 or 2 hours. And because my parents actually could not read or write, they can only speak. And my parents only spoke Cantonese, or even a dialect of Cantonese called Toisan. That's what my parents grew up. So Mandarin, I had no help. I mean, I was literally on my own. That's another reason why, I have a lot of this isolationist kind of tendencies, because the things that I did, my parents really couldn't help me much. Past middle school, my parents could not help me with schoolwork. I was on my own, for the most part. So, a lot of that was kind of self-starting, if you will, or just self-effacing in that regard. So, unfortunately, yes, I'm not, I cannot speak Chinese hardly at all. Cannot carry on a conversation whatsoever. It's funny because some of my relatives who can, they forget sometimes that I'm not fluent or can't understand it, and they'll speak to me, and I'll have to say, time out, you need to do it over in English. And then they obviously remember. Some of them still frown at that. So how come you never learned? Like, well, I don't know what to tell you. I guess I'm just a bad Chinese person. That's just the way it is. I can't speak my own language.
And we are very honored to hear the stories from your aunt and uncle, Edward Chen and Eugenia Chen. And can you share with some of the stories between you and your uncle and aunt? And have they like tried to tell you some of the stories of the history of Chinese American in Houston from your side? From your end?
Yeah, of course. My mother, that's how I'm related to Edward Chen, is my mother and Dr. Chen are brother and sister. My mother is the older of the two. There were only two in the family, and they were 2 years apart, if I'm not mistaken, 2 to 3 years apart. So they're relatively close. Um, my uncle, Dr. Chen, he had two kids as well, a boy and a girl. The girl is 1 year older than I am, and the boy is 5 years younger than I am. My sister is about 7 years younger than I am, so a much longer gap. But because we were somewhat close in age, my older cousin, the girl that's 1 year older, and the boy who's 5 years younger, even though that was not as much, we'd spend a lot of time together because that was my social circle, really. Because remember, my cousins on my dad's side were 8 to 10, 9 years older than I am, or 7 to 8 years younger than I am. So I was caught in the middle. I was the only one on my dad's side that was my age. So my cousin, her name is Karen, Dr. Chen's daughter, was the one I hung around with. So a lot of things that I recall, in dealing with and interacting with my uncle and my aunt was because of my interaction with my cousin. We do sleepovers all the time at each other's house. I know my uncle for a hobby. There are a couple of things that I remember from my childhood. He loved to bowl, and so there are times when we go bowling. There was this bowling alley nearby his house at the time over there in Bel Air, and there are times that we'd go over there and there's on particular days they have specials, all you can bowl for 2 hours, for a certain price, and he would take us there, and I would bowl during the summer. There was a summer league for Chinese kids, CACA, Chinese American Citizens Alliance is the organization. The youth club, if you will, had a bowling league for the summer when the kids were out of school, and I would do every summer. I know it's something I very much look forward to when I was growing up, because again, it was a social thing and being around other Chinese. But my uncle very much was into that. Another thing that I remember is that he loved to play bridge, the card game, and he taught me and taught my cousin. And there are times that we'd play bridge, I won't say all night, but there are times that we get together and we just play cards. So it's a good way to interact and share about family and catch up on all that. And of course, my mother would come over and spend time, just talking to my uncle, her brother a lot. So a lot of that's what I remember about interaction, between, our families in that regard.
Yeah, thank you for helping us connect that part of the history, especially in your family history. As we move on to your education experience, can you talk a little bit about your memories around Rice University back then?
Yeah, it's funny because when I graduated from high school, as I was preparing for graduation, I went to Ailey Hastings. Okay, that's the high school I went to. I graduated number 2 in my class. I was salutatorian. And there's a whole story behind that, and my mother was really upset about it because I actually, in her mind, deserved to be number 1. But you know how again, Chinese culture, right? Education, competition in that regard, very much a focus point. But it doesn't matter at this stage, But the salutatorian, so I got to make my speech and all that, at graduation. I actually got a full ride scholarship to Texas A&M here in Texas, College Station, and I was actually looking forward to at least visiting the campus and kind of seeing what that's all about, because I think when you get to a certain age, and remember, my life was very sheltered, right? That's another thing growing up. My father, because he was in the business of the grocery store 24/7, we never took vacations. Never. The only vacation we got was when he would close the store on Sunday afternoons, and we would go to Galveston or Freeport to go fish, right? That's one of the things that we would do. And that's really not much of a vacation, right? When you talk about a typical vacation, when you go see different states or go, cars or fly somewhere. I didn't take my first plane trip until I was in college. I mean, that just kind of tells you, the kind of sheltered life that I led. But point being is about my education is that maybe a typical, teenager that age, because I lived such a sheltered life, I really wanted to branch out. I really wanted to, experience new things. But, my parents, particularly my mother, said, no, you're going to go to Rice. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So I really didn't have much of a choice. I applied to Rice, of course, and I did my best during the interview process, and I was accepted, of course. But honestly, I was looking forward to perhaps pursuing an opportunity to go elsewhere. That being said, Rice being obviously the school that it is, um, very competitive for sure. Now, honestly, at the time, I laugh about it now, but the kind of stress my daughters went through as they went through their college application. I was sharing with my wife, who also is a Rice grad, by the way, Kathy. We kind of joke saying, if we had to go through that process again now, knowing what our girls went through in their high school to prepare for it, we don't know if we would make it to Rice because the standards and the competition is just so much more intense, nowadays than it was when we were growing up. But I think to some extent it was, I at least got to experience some college life during my sophomore and junior year when I was able to live on campus. Again, my parents were very attached to me in that regard. I think, of course, my father, value of money. Why do you want to spend money to go live on campus when you have a free room here at house, at the home, right? But I think, and that's when my girls, when they went to school, even when my first daughter went for 1 year to University of Houston, we put her in the dorm and she wanted to be there because it's a part of the maturation process, to be away from home, to learn to be on your own, to experience the things that you need to grow up. And that's part of what I was able to experience to some extent, but yet being here in Houston to still be close to home, if have that home base to work from, if you will. But the educational experience, it was definitely a new world. I think coming from high school where a lot of things came easy, intellectually speaking, academically speaking, but at Rice, everybody else is like you, if not smarter, faster, better in terms of how they can do things. So it was a humbling experience, definitely going to Rice in that regard for me. I look back on it, there are certainly times when it wasn't easy, but I'm thankful to Rice for the educational foundation they gave me, the notoriety that a degree from Rice carries. Definitely, if anything, gets your foot in the door. It gives you credibility. You still have to make it on your own merit, obviously, in your performance in your job or whatever you're doing. But at least it gives you credibility to get started, right? And I think that's what I've told my girls about the schools they went to. My oldest, grad school at Rice. My second daughter, Megan, she finished and got her 4-year degree at Southern Methodist in Dallas. She got double major and then a minor. She got accepted to Columbia grad school in New York. So, a very prestigious school in her field. And so we're very pleased and proud of her in that regard. The education, the notoriety of the school you go to, it certainly cannot be understated. So, and I experienced the social aspect. That's where I met my wife, Kathy. And so, some of the social aspects there. And I still think back, I certainly had a lot of Caucasian friends and other ethnicities, but even at Rice, we still would gravitate toward having our circle of Chinese friends and Chinese circle, right? So even then, as Americanized as I am, or I was at the time, there still was this, I guess, I don't say unconscious draw, but kind of just this gravitation toward, people that are like you, if you will. I think there's just some semblance of unconscious that they think they can understand the things you're going through, because there's other American-born Chinese, or ABCs that we call ourselves, right? That I would, within my circle, that we dealt with. Now, Kathy, my wife, she was born in Taiwan, and she immigrated over when she was 12. So she wasn't like me in that capacity, but she was here long enough that she had assimilated into the American culture, pretty well. So there wasn't a lot of friction in that regard. But anyway, so for Rice, I think a lot of things that definitely were pluses. Some things that I think a drawback, because I wasn't able to really leave the city, and go out to really, experience some of that on my own. But looking back, I do not regret, the decision in that regard. So it's worked out well.
And what were some of the defining moments, if you recall, during your time at Rice?
Wow, defining moments. In a negative sense, or kind of a humbling sense, because you're used to getting straight A's, right, in high school, and a lot of things coming easy. The first time I got an exam score back that was like, I think it was like 54, 55, something like that. You can imagine the shock that I had, but it ended up being a B, because college is great on curves. And that kind of gave me a wake-up call, saying this is not going to be like it was in high school. And don't take that as a false sense of security that you got to be, but knowing that things are difficult here, things are going to be where you need to actually, change how you study, how you learn, right, and how you deal with things. Because for me, I think the defining moment there is knowing that in order to really be successful, while there are things I had to do on my own for sure, and remember, I grew up, developing this isolationist attitude. I had to develop a circle of people and friends that I could, as our study group, right, to work through together, to teach each other, to help each other through problems and understand and comprehend things. And those study groups were very instrumental, in getting me through, a lot of these tougher classes. So that's one of the defining moments for sure, is how to deal with, um, the humbling experience, right, of the grades and things like that. Um, I think, in knowing that no one's going to help you no one's going to be there to, like a teacher or a parent, to tell you, go do your homework, right? Go make sure you handle this. You really have to develop the independence, even being in Houston, right? Having to go through that. I think that's one of the defining moments that's there. I think, in high school, I would organize various clubs and things, different events and such, but nowhere near on the scale is what we would do at Rice and some of the organizations and clubs I was involved with. And having interaction with the city and a lot of the things that we did with Rice. And of course, at the time, I was still active in church. So I think some of the defining moments was how, and I was able to interact with a lot of the city leaders, particularly in the Chinese community. Seeing that there's more out there than just what I'm exposed to at school or in my family or even in my church. And so that was also, I think, a watershed moment, knowing that, hey, Houston, being the size of it is, even at that time, a lot of culture out there, people in the Chinese community that don't even know or even experience and what they do, and being able to experience that was definitely a bonus for me in that regard. I think some of the other things that go along with college life, the different foods you have and the different kind of social events, intramurals, all the different sporting activities and things, experiencing, attending sporting events and getting crazy, like you see college on TV, dressing up and putting makeup on your face. I never did any of that to that degree, but experiencing that was definitely, a fun time for me. And, I do fondly remember some of those things that we went through in that regard. So yeah, those are definitely some things there that were, resonate with me even today.
Did you hit beer bikes back
Beer
then?
bike? So I didn't know if you're going to ask that or not. I did not participate as a beer drinker. I was a reserve on a biker one year, is what I did. So, I just wasn't that gifted of an athlete, if you will. But certainly, I was one of those, because, it's very competitive at Rice, beer bike. And, it's one of those things that we just, it's a very strong team building or college building. Baker, I was part of Baker. That's where I was a member of. But, I think it was 8 colleges at the time when I was there, and so definitely the competitive spirit was high, around then. But no, I did not ride, I did not drink, but certainly we all participated and joined in, of course, at the time. So yeah, that was fun.
And in terms of your major, can you tell us how you decided on pursuing it?
Well, out of high school, I think you think about what is it that you're good at, right? What are your strengths? What are your proficiencies? And science and math, very much where my strong suits were, which is all to some degree another stereotype of Chinese and Asian, which is, I don't know, that's not fair, because my girls, they're, I don't say not good at that, they're proficient for sure, but their strengths are more into the liberal arts side, if you will. Anyway, but for me, my strengths and I guess preferences were in the science and math. So when you look at majors, you look at different kind of things that are available. I kind of gravitated toward that. I think to some degree it was also influenced by my parents and my uncle, Dr. Chen, and my aunt Eugenie. She, they definitely tried to push me away from, I think it's a term at Rice we call academics, academic versus SEs, right? And so going into that field, I think it was something that I had pursued that drove me to go that route for engineering. So, and then once you're in engineering, then which one, right? Chemical engineering, mechanical, double E, and this is the things that I because I was interested in computers at the time, and of course, during growing up for me, it was very much the infancy stage. So the natural inclination was double E. So that's where I went to. As I got into my junior and senior year, I decided to specialize actually to be a little different, to kind of see where it was, because Rice located right near the medical center, right? So at the time, Rice offered 4 different tracks for its double E program. One was what they call triple C, or circuits control communication, which is where most of the double E's went. That's where my wife got her degree, is a triple C double E. The second one was actually a focus in computer science. The third one was actually more physics intensive, lasers, if you will. And then the fourth was bioengineering. Physics wasn't my cup of tea. That's the one that I got the 54 in. And then, I knew it was going to be difficult for me to really, probably excel in that particular vein. So I went into bioengineering because I had some interest in robotics and of course being in medical field, things like that, and doing a lot of work in the medical center as well. So all these interests is kind of what played into, and of course my parents were very pleased with it. Oh, medicine, yeah, right, and engineering. So of course they were all behind that, and so that's where I ended up getting my degree, as double E with an emphasis in bioengineering. I also got a double major. I don't know if you saw my profile there. A Bachelor of Arts in Mathematical Sciences, so statistical math, things like that, math modeling. So I think there's a lot of correlation and overlap there. I find it interesting, of course, because that's not where I end up going. I end up working for Shell Oil Company, which had nothing to do with bioengineering, and then I moved to NASA, which also had nothing to do with bioengineering or medical, and then of course I went to Compaq and HP. So it's interesting how things work out, but it's still, I think, again, lays the foundation and gives me a solid base to work from. So that's kind of why I migrated to the degrees that I did at Rice.
Was there any person or any mentor that significantly impacted your decision or any kind of life history during your?
Not so much within my family. Honestly, again, a lot of remember my father, he did not finish college. My mother did, but she wasn't really into a lot of strong academia. Now, my uncle, of course, he's a professor in chemistry. My aunt were also very well educated. But in that regard, there really wasn't a lot of push from them beyond, oh, you don't want to be a liberal arts, right? You don't want to be that kind of person. You want to be engineering and science and engineering. So besides that, as long as I was in some field like that, there really wasn't a lot of mentoring or a lot of pressure besides that, if you will. As long as I did well in what I was doing, and was able to be successful in that, and if you will, felt that I could make a living out of it, they were supportive in that regard. And honestly, at school, there really wasn't anybody that was a mentor or a real, now in college, there really wasn't somebody that was a real strong influencer, if you will, or mentor in my college years. High school, there were a couple of teachers that very much, I think, looking back, I think they saw, or at least they felt they saw a lot of potential in me, if you will. And they were very much took the time to mentor and guide me about not just the schoolwork, but about preparing for college, in life in that regard. And I'm thankful for them taking me aside, because again, my parents, workaholics, right? Another Chinese attribute, which I find myself, unfortunately, having to do many times, right? That's the problem that I face in trying to find the work-life balance. But I'm thankful, for those teachers and mentors in my high school days, during my formative years, if you will, that kind of taught me a lot about life lessons, and balancing school and the things to how to prepare yourself to be successful, at the next level. So
Thank you for sharing. And you and your wife both were part of Rice University. Did you meet back then during college?
So she was a senior in high school at in Houston, Westbury High School, when we first met. And she tells me she always wanted to go to Rice, even if her and I weren't, dating at the time. But we actually started dating for serious or for real during her senior year, spring semester, I guess. And then of course, then she went to Rice, and we were together ever since. So we dated for, oh gosh, 6 years before we got married. Got married in 1988, and then of course, still together. So thank God for her being here, and we have the 2 daughters, of course. So yeah, it's been Fun ride. 33 years. 33 years we've been married together. So yeah, we can thank Rice for bringing us together. I guess they definitely had a hand in that.
Yeah, it's wonderful how your family has been so closely connected to rice in so many ways. Uh,
Yeah, whether we wanted to or not, I suppose that's kind of how it's played out for sure.
And can you tell us a little bit about your career experience as an Asian American in the workplace?
Yeah, so of course I had part-time jobs going up in high school and even college. In college, I actually did some work for the university, grading, lab work, things like that. But in terms of real job, right, getting right out of school, I received an offer and worked for Shell Oil Company here in Houston again, over there on Interstate 10 and there Ashford, if you're familiar with the city. Anyway, but I was a seismic geophysicist. It's a fancy name, but what I was doing was basically there were people in the field in the U.S., if you will, that would um, take readings from the Earth. They would send shock waves or signals, seismic signals down to the Earth, and we'd have sensors on the surface that we would take readings to determine do we have hydrocarbon deposits or natural gas deposits, underneath. And my job was to interpret the results and using these complex programs to see if we have it there. Now, I started in June of 1985. So I graduated in May of 85 from Rice. And so 1 month after I started working, of course, the oil industry, very volatile, the energy industry, very volatile at the time. And in Houston, because it's very much a prevailing industry, a lot of turnover, a lot of mobility, if you will, good and bad. Um, Turns out that I was caught in a layoff a year later from Shell. Shell had actually done 2 or 3 layoffs during the year before I got laid off. But the one that in June of '86, or 1 year later, after I hired on, is what affected all first year employees. So of course I was part of that group. But things worked out. Of course, 2 months later, I got a job with NASA, the space industry, National Aeronautics Space Administration, and then I was there for, let's see, get this right, 11 years, and working in flight control in the shuttle program. It's possible if you go on the internet and Google some videos of the Mission Control Center from that time period, you may actually see me there on tape somewhere. It's possible. I was in the front room there, manning consoles, the data processing systems console for many flights. It was certainly a wonderful experience when I look back on it. It definitely gave me a lot of practical experience in the working world, knowing what it takes to be successful. But at the time, Kathy and I, we got to the point where we wanted to start a family. And being in flight control, it was very, very difficult. In fact, NASA, during the Apollo days, and even during the space shuttle days when I was there, divorce rates among flight controllers was very, very high, because when you're supporting missions, that's your life. You're supporting the teams, if you will, are supporting 24/7 as long as somebody's up in the air in space. So we'd go on shifts, right, and support that. And inevitably, you're going to get what we call a red eye shift or midnight shift. Um, and then 2 or 3 days later, you have to come in and switch your circadian rhythms to support a normal shift. When you're not supporting an actual mission, you're training for the next mission. So it can be very physically and mentally taxing, and to go through that. When you're young and you have energy and you don't have any other obligations, you can afford to put your investment into your job at potential expense of your family. But when we wanted to have children, the girls, Kathy and I decided that I needed to find something more stable in terms of work schedule. So toward the end of my career at NASA, what's ironic is I probably today would still be there if it wasn't for how this played out, because I had went to my managers and my bosses and my directors and say, I like working for NASA. Obviously, I feel I'm good at my job, and they knew I was good at my job, and that's what kind of worked against us, because flight control at the time, it's not a job that you can pull somebody off the street and they can be serviceable in a month's time or even 2 months' time. It requires a good 2 to 3 years of training before you become, serviceable, and they can trust you to do your job. Unfortunately, with budgets from the government the way they are, and the situation was, because in the latter part of my career at NASA, I was actually a manager, first level manager, responsible for the group. And so I was the one that was actually training people. I was the one that was actually assigning people to work the console on different shifts. But attrition, again, very high because of just the physically taxing and demanding job. we could not bring on people at a rate to account for the people we were losing. Another thing too, we were very much dependent upon contractors. So it wasn't just civil servant, because I was a civil servant. I worked for the federal government, but there were those that a lot of our workforce was contractor, and the advancement potential in career just wasn't there for them in the contractor ranks. So when they achieve a certain level of proficiency or certification, they would move on to something else, still within their contractor company, but they would leave flight control. So again, all these factors contributed to where it got to a point where even though I was a manager, I was still working console, actually working shifts and missions. There are times we do 10 missions a year. You're supposed to work at most half of them, because you could rotate among everybody else. But when I left the NASA, I was working 8 to 9 of the 10 missions a year. And so it was quite difficult for me, physically, mentally. And again, there was no way I was going to be able to be there for my family, when we have kids, children, at the age, babies. There was no way. So I went to go look for other opportunities within NASA, because NASA has certainly a big organization like that, other opportunities. But it was ironic in the sense that as I interviewed for other positions, NASA has this policy where your actually current organization could put a block on you moving because you were so critical to the role. And that's kind of what happened with me, is that my bosses that you're too valuable and critical in your role where you're at now. We can't let you leave to go on to something else. And we obviously negotiated and worked on this thing. Well, look, guys, my situation. You got to give me some assurance. You're going to be allow me to hire people to give us some relief. And they would do what they can, but there was again, it takes a good 2 years, to train somebody, and we just weren't able to hire enough. And so I told them, okay, guys, you leave me no choice, but I'm going to have to look for opportunities outside of NASA. As much as it pains me, I'm going to have to do that. If that had played out differently, they found and they were able to let me go to another position in NASA, I probably would still be there. Like my wife, Kathy, she started NASA right out of school. She'll tell you this when you interview her at some point in November, I guess. She's been there 33 some odd years. I probably would be a lifer with them as well. But because of that choice point, family over career at that time, that's when I interviewed with Compaq and other companies, and I ended up getting an offer from Compaq, which eventually became Hewlett Packard, of course, in 2003. So I've been with them now for, let's see, this will be my 24th year. I'm going on 25. My 25th anniversary with HP/Compaq will be in March of this upcoming. So, you can tell I tend to be very stable where I'm going. So 11 years with NASA and now 25 with the Compaq/HP. And that's how my career has kind of migrated, if you will. I've had many different roles in Compaq and HP, from server group to now I'm in the personal systems, which is the laptops and notebooks and workstations, different organizations, development, and now I'm in the supply chain group, responsible for the factory tools worldwide. That's why I have teams in Taipei. I have people in Mexico. We have people in Europe, people in China that I deal with. So worldwide, absolutely, is the avenue and the arena that I play in these days. It's been a good experience, I think, definitely culturally. Being able to expand and deal with different peoples and understanding in a global economy, a global environment. The pandemic has played havoc with us, obviously, but going through that has been very good for me in that regard. So there's a lot more I can probably tell you about the technical details of my job, but that might take way too much time. So maybe I'll just leave it there. That's kind of where my work history has been.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing the stories. And next, I'm wondering if you could share with us some of the stories of your involvement with the community. You mentioned you've been a deacon at the Chinese Baptist Church. Maybe you could start with that and maybe tell us a little bit about the history of the church.
Yeah, the church in 1953, like I said, that's when it started. And honestly, when it first started, it was I don't know how much you know about churches and particularly Protestant Baptist churches. We were actually a missions church or a church plant. When there's a church that gets big enough, they want to grow and they multiply. So they actually send people off to start a new church, from their own home base. So Chinese Baptist Church, my church, is actually one of those. We were a church plant, if you will, or from First Baptist Church in Houston. Okay, that's how we started. And of course, it was predominantly at that time mainly for the purpose of getting or providing an opportunity for Chinese people, right, to get together. And of course, in the setting of trying to promote some some grow spiritually and in a religious way. And so initially back in the 50s and 60s, it really was very much social in that regard. And of course, as the people were in the church and they started having kids, and of course the things start growing, if you will, I think there's a certain level of maturity that comes up in the church of how people start focusing on the real basis for what a church is about. Understanding what it means to be a believer, what it means to be a Christian. How do you exercise the spiritual gifts that God's given you? There's so much more I can get into. And again, I started attending when I was in middle school, and then I became actually a formal member and got baptized. In the Baptist theology, we actually get fully dunked, full immersion is what we call it, not sprinkled or anything like that. We go fully under into the tank. I did that in my early college days when I got baptized. And of course, I got married. Kathy and I got married at CBC. And then, like I said, our girls they weren't literally born at church, but, as soon as they were, well enough or had all their inoculations, we took them to church and the nursery and all that. So they really grew up, basically born and grew up in the church. I served in many capacities at church. I still do to this day. I teach Sunday school. Right now I teach. I was very active in the youth ministry, teaching a lot of the high school and middle schoolers for a time, very close to the youth pastors and youth ministers, helping them out in their ministry. I've taught many adults classes and a young marrieds class when Kathy and I were in that demographic. Now I'm teaching, I guess they call it the older millennial class. Those that were born in the 1980s and early 90s. I'm teaching that class now as adults, if you will, a group of adults. I also help lead worship. I play guitar, acoustic, electric, bass. So I'm on the praise team, and I've been on that team for probably, 20, 25 years now. I've served in that capacity, singing as well. So, and there are many other different, I guess I'll call it administrative related committees that I've been on, personnel and some of the audiovisual committees and Lord's Supper and all the different things that we have to go through. But admittedly, most of my time over the last 10, 15 years has been through my deacon obligations. I don't know how much you know about Baptist, hierarchy or governance. We have the pastors, of course, the church that are the spiritual leaders and the teachers, if you will. But deacons, we're also ordained, so we're called into the ministry. We don't get paid for it, in terms of financial benefit. But we're there to really assist the pastors, and that's why a lot of deacons we're involved in teaching, leading, mentoring a lot of the congregation. So a lot of my time is spent actually in consultation and teaching people, advising, going through difficulties and conflicts in the church. Because anytime you have people, you're going to have conflict. So we're having to deal with that, be peacemakers, go through that, go through discussions about, hey, the church, do we see that we have to go donate this money to this mission or this cause? We'd be involved with those discussions. There's a plethora of things that we have to discuss as deacons. There's about 10 of us now at my church at CBC that are deacons. And yeah, it's quite busy for us. We're definitely looking for more men, if you will, to step up to serve in that capacity. But for now, we're doing what we can, and trying to serve God and serve the church in the ways that we're led to. And so yeah, it's a very big part of my life and my family's life as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Helen has told you about another lead intern in the program, that she is conducting a research project on the network of Chinese churches. So I'm sure she'll really appreciate the narrative from you.
Sure. I mean, if she needs anything from me, I'll be happy to share, what I can. Certainly there's certain sensitive things I may not be able to get into, but yeah, if there's anything I can do, because I'm very familiar with many of the Chinese churches in Houston, for sure. My mother-in-law, like I said, is a devout believer and Christian. She attends church regularly, even though most of it's virtual now because of the pandemic, but very active. When she was going in person, she would teach in the children's department and very active. So there's a lot of Christian influence, right, that I have in my family and immediate circle. So yeah, if there's anything that Helen would like to talk to me about, yeah, I'll be open, certainly, and share what I can.
And how many people did the church begin with, if you would, and how many people are there now?
Yeah, begin with, it was small, of course, as a church plant from First Baptist. I think I remember seeing some of the pictures, maybe 40 to 50 people, I think, coming. But of course, as word got around, hey, we got a church now for us, right? A lot of the people in Houston would be interested. Unfortunately, as you probably realize reading the history, a lot of Chinese in Houston having their own businesses, restaurants and grocery stores and things like that, they'd be open 7 days a week. So on Sundays, when people typically would go to church, they're still open, they're working. So that was one of the challenges. Even today, we face that. A lot of people that, in church, they work on Sundays. Sometimes, and these are professionals like pharmacists, right, or medical professionals. They don't necessarily get to pick their hours or their shifts, right? So they're having to work on Sundays, and it's something that we just have to accommodate, right? Obviously, they're involved and they're active when they can be, but the work calls them away. I have this one guy in my class that I teach. He's an EMT doctor, emergency medical team doctor. He's on call a lot of times, or he's working on Sunday mornings, Sunday evenings, Saturday night. We can't have him in class all the time because his job just requires elsewhere. So it was tough, right, back then in that early stages of the church's development to get people to come and to really grow the church. But they had a solid base, and just over time, things organically happen. When they have kids, they get married, they have kids, and word of mouth comes. Right now, CBC, we have 3 congregations. Okay, one is the English-speaking congregation. We have one that's Cantonese speaking, and then one that's Mandarin speaking. Right now, our Mandarin, we have about 30 people that attend regularly, of course, online as well because of the pandemic. Cantonese, probably about 80 to 90 that attend regularly. And the English side, probably about 150 to 200. Now, when we were before the pandemic, the numbers were higher all across the board. But, now virtually, we still have, I'd say, 25, 30% of people of our church still attend, but they do it via Zoom or, virtual online. So, it kind of gives you a sense for the membership that's active. On our membership rolls, we have about 1,100 people on the membership rolls. But again, a fraction of that is actually maybe, 400 to 500 maybe, or what come in person at some point in time, one of the services.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm also wondering, since Chinese is as an ethnicity, like there's like Chinese mainland and like Taiwanese and like Malaysian Chinese, and also there's first and second generation, third generation like yourself. Like how would you describe the kind of diversity of your church?
Yeah, it's at times it causes friction. I'll be honest with you. I think there's a cultural challenge sometimes between all the different ethnicities. And you actually mentioned it, even among the Chinese speaking, Cantonese to Mandarin. And even within the Mandarin, there's mainland Chinese, there's Taiwan, there's Hong Kong. And Hong Kong has both Cantonese and Mandarin, predominantly Cantonese. So there's cultural differences when you're talking about OBCs or overseas born Chinese, and then ABCs, American born Chinese. Now in my church, Chinese Baptist Church, the biggest congregation or the biggest majority, if you will, of members are ABC, American-born Chinese, like myself. In other Chinese churches in Houston, which Helen probably has learned, it's the other way around, where the larger congregations are the Mandarin-speaking or potentially Cantonese-speaking. So it's a different dynamic for us. I think there are times when trying to educate people within my demographic, the English-speaking, about the cultural sensitivities of those from mainland China, those from Taiwan. An example about some of the sensitivities, or I should say uncertainties that the mainland Chinese people sometimes have about politics, and I don't want to make it uncomfortable for you, but I think some of that plays into how they think or treat government, and what they believe about that. I have 2 mainland Chinese ladies in my class. They work in the med center, and we have conversations about that from time to time, how it's sometimes difficult to and because they see the political, better or worse, some of the political freedoms of the ability to speak out, in America here, where in China that's not possible, right? Or it's very much, taught not to do that, right? And it's part of respecting elders, but it's also because of the way the government chooses to run the country. So whereas in America, in U.S. here, and even in Taiwan, freedom of speech, right? Even though you may disagree with the government, you have that right and freedom to speak your mind, if you will, in a non-threatening, non-confrontational manner. But some people in our congregation don't really get that sometimes, and trying to understand how sometimes there's this element of people coming in from mainland China that have just this element of being very much themselves because they don't want to divulge anything. They want to keep things very private, and it takes them a long time to open up, right? And so getting our English congregation to understand that at times is a challenge, because here in America we're very open. Here in Texas, very friendly, very open, right? And it's sometimes difficult for them. And even now in the English congregation in our church, we're more than just Chinese. We have we actually have a Russian fellowship, believe it or not. A number, about 20 people from a Russian fellowship that are a part of our church. But we have Caucasian, we have African American, some Hispanics. Now, admittedly, predominantly Chinese, but there's still the other, cultures, ethnicities there. So I think there's also still some element of friction there, where our Cantonese and Mandarin speaking congregations are not that, I won't say comfortable, but in tune with those other cultures to be able to relate to them on a comfortable level. And so there's some of that dynamic that plays in, for sure. And just philosophy too. Our Cantonese pastor, my English pastors, sometimes they don't agree, right? Because of just their background and what they believe is how they should carry out their ministry. And a lot of it is cultural based, right? So those are the things that me as a deacon, we're having to deal with, right? How do we, be able to get people to work together without disrespecting, culture and background? It's a very much a challenge for us. And, we're doing what we can. It's people.
How would you describe your church and how it differs from, say, another church?
Yeah, I think when you look at some of the other Chinese churches. Okay, well, so if you look at churches in general, obviously we're Chinese church, so predominantly Chinese. That's one difference in a lot of other Baptist churches in Texas. Southern Baptist, as a matter of fact. Now, Southern Baptist is a huge denomination. So there's Caucasian churches, there's African American, Hispanic, all different ethnicities. But that is one way. But if you're asking about comparison with other Chinese churches, it's kind of like I said before. For us, we're, I think, somewhat unique in the sense that our largest congregation by far is our English-speaking congregation, our American-born Chinese congregation. That is one thing that we have that I think is different than other Chinese churches in the area. There's one called Houston Chinese Church. Their largest is Mandarin. There are other smaller Chinese churches in Houston. There's Fort Bend Chinese Church here that my mother-in-law goes to. Their largest congregation is also Mandarin and speaking. And so, it's a different approach when you talk about what is your, I won't say strength, but where's your resource base from? Because as part of attending the church, we volunteer and we participate in the ministry. So, where your comfort level is. If you ask me to minister to someone who doesn't understand English, I'm not going to do very well because I can't relate to them, right? So that's why for us, when we talk about where our focus point needs to be and where it should be, is how do you leverage, I won't say the strength, if you will, or the resource base that you have. For us, it needs to be in either those who want to assimilate into the Western culture, because like I said, I have two people from mainland China that attend my class. They speak English, right? It's not their first language, but they carry on English conversations just fine. So, but they feel they want to and have a desire to assimilate into the Western culture, right? Kind of what I did just by happenstance of my upbringing. But for them, they actually have an intentionality to do that. So they look for us on the English side to help them through that. And of course, those who are American born like me, 3-4 generations in, this is definitely where their sweet spot is. That's where they're most comfortable. Whereas going to another church that also has English speaking congregations, but it's the minority, maybe that is for them because they want a smaller group, right? So it just depends on what the person is looking for, in that regard. So for us, I think that's one unique thing is that we, I don't say specialize, but we have a strength in English speaking Chinese American ministry, right? Whereas other churches don't tend to have the volume or the background that we do in that regard. We're also located centrally in the city. That's another thing too. Our church, most churches tend to be community, like within 5, maybe 7 miles within the church's boundaries. They all congregate at the church, right? For CBC, we actually have city church. We have people that live 30, 40 miles away that come to the church because of that connection to being Chinese, right? Don't get me wrong. There are some that come because it's the closest church to them, right? But many of them because that's where they grew up or they want the affinity with the American and English-speaking Chinese. So that's what attracts them and draws them, to our church. So we have people that live in the Woodlands. People like me live in Sugar Land, Katy, Clear Lake. I'm naming all these neighborhoods. I don't know if that's familiar to you, but they're like 30, 40, 50 miles away, from the church. So that's something that's also very unique, for us, which can be challenging, right? Because if you want to start to segment and go into different neighborhoods or areas, you've got to determine, okay, well, who lives in Sugar Land? Can you do a ministry there? Who lives in Clear Lake? Do a ministry there, as opposed to, hey, well, we're all within 5 miles of the church, so we can have a lot more flexibility there. But it's definitely different for us in that capacity.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm sure Helen will really appreciate your narrative.
Sure.
And next, we're going to move on to your chapter of life since 2020, how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted your life.
Wow.
And
I think for me, work related, I'm very blessed and fortunate that Hewlett Packard, they're based in California and Palo Alto. That's the headquarters, but they have a sizable population in Houston. In fact, now, just because of the way things have been reorganized and moved within the company, the Houston campus is actually the largest in the U.S. For HP. I'm very fortunate and blessed that HP took a very sympathetic and caring approach with its employees. I still recall going through it in March of 2020 when we went through the discussions, and because January is when we started getting the news, right, about COVID hitting and just started seeing things ramp up. But HP took swift action, and starting in March, they said, okay, everybody worldwide, you will work from home. We're going to try to protect our employees as best they can, or and try to do our part to control the spread and to eliminate the now it's pandemic, but that time it was epidemic. And so it was a difficult transition for a lot of people. Now in my role, even though I'm in engineering, if you will, software development, there's still a good part of what we can do that is virtual or remote. Okay. Now there's some of my group that their primary role was to be in the lab, to do testing and things. So it was very difficult for them. But with technology these days, we're able to actually provide equipment or configure things so they can remote in to their equipment in the lab and do their jobs. So we've been virtual, remote, if you will, since March of 2020 until now, present. There were times when HP had communicated, well, we're seeing the trends go down and we may be prepared to bring it back on in half the week, to come in and start easing in, because we didn't want to have everybody come in at once because you just have too much, density of people. But then we'd have the Delta variant, right, that came out recently. And of course, it just seems to never end. So right now, we're still completely virtual, working from home. For me, actually, it's worked out very well because I live in Sugar Land, and where the HP office where I would normally go, it takes me an hour and a half to drive one way. So I'm spending 3 hours on the road minimum going to and from work when I actually go in the office. Now, because I'm a manager, there's certain value in me being there to be face to face with my employees, right? And it has nothing to do with trust. It's about maintaining the connection and building the relationship with the employee. Now, I have people that work for me in Taiwan, people that work for me in Mexico. So obviously I can't be there in person all the time. We would travel there once a quarter, just to make sure we stay in touch with the employees. But when the pandemic hit, everything was virtual. But because of the fact I had people in Taiwan and I was doing things 80, 90% of the time virtual with them anyway, there really wasn't much of an adjustment, in dealing and working with them. And of course, the peer organizations that I worked with were in the same situation. We had people all over the globe, and people actually in other cities in the US that were not face to face or sitting next to in the office. So for me, at least, it was actually a smooth transition. The challenge for me, I will say, is actually in maintaining work-life balance. For me, there are times when the work hours and the family hours, it blends. I'm working 12, 14 hours a day, and I don't even know it because I don't leave my home, right? I don't go from my desk. And we're empty nesters right now. Both my girls are in college. They're at a different house. So my wife and I both, we do meetings. And of course, I have meetings in the evening, just like I'm doing with you now. It's my night time. I have meetings with my Taiwan folks throughout the week. So I'm used to meeting at night. So there are times in my work, it just blurs the lines between the two. So that's my challenge, is how do I separate, have discipline to showcase or to be able to say, okay, I'm at work now. Okay, I got to stop work and be able to devote time to my wife and my family in that regard. So again, I don't have kids at home, So it's actually even harder for me because the work hours just continue to blend. My wife, the same thing. I think it's been that challenge for her. Or NASA. She, of course, also NASA is virtual all from home. So it's convenient in that regard because she does a lot of business travel with her job, but all the international travel has been obviously stopped and suspended. She just took her first business trip a month ago, domestic to Washington, D.C. for 3, 4 days. The first time she's done that in 2 years. I mean, she enjoys travel, if you will. And admittedly, we reap some benefits from that with her frequent flyer miles and all that. But for her, it's different being able to have to do, she still has to do the interaction and meetings with the Europeans, with the Japanese, with the Russians, if you will, a lot of discussions she has. So there are times when she has to get up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, my time, right, to prepare for 4 a.m. meetings. But when if you have to choose whether getting on a plane, and travel 14 hours on a plane to get somewhere or with multiple stops, change your sleeping habits, go there for a couple of weeks and then come back and switch back, I think she probably would say that it's better for her to stay home and just adjust because at least she can sleep in her own bed. She can at least have the comfort of being home, even though her sleep cycles are going to be off, but it's easier to adjust, back and forth. I think the most thing I missed about or what that's impacted with COVID is the social interaction. Like at church, we were virtual church for probably I'd say 14, 16 months, ever since March of that time. And church very much predicates on interaction, right, and being together and sharing with each other. And virtually in service or in Sunday school, it was very difficult to do that in a virtual environment. We started going back in person partially about 3 or 4 months ago, and not everybody's back still not everybody's back. And so we're having to deal with that. So in terms of negative impact, that's been the biggest thing for me personally. And I think my family is the social interaction, dealing with people face to face. I mean, without getting into too much of the politics, there's still a lot of emotion, a lot of debates about do you get vaccinated, do you not get vaccinated? People won't get vaccinated, and despite the data that's there and, without getting into all that, it just creates a lot of anger, a lot of emotional intensity with people on both sides of the issue. That's one other thing that I've been kind of sorry to see played out. I mean, I understand how it is, but it's unfortunate that people just can't be more accepting and more willing to do what's right for society in that regard. And even in other countries too, it's been still difficult, but not near as intense as it is in the U.S. America, the land of plenty, we have vaccines enough for anybody who wants it, and there are people that just refuse to get it because of various reasons. Okay, I respect that decision, but you have to understand there are ramifications to that decision, whereas people in other countries, even in Taiwan, my people who work for me in Taiwan, some of them want to get the vaccine, but they cannot get it because it's not available yet in some areas. It's kind of sad, having that where America has it, but people won't get it, but in other countries they want it, but they can't have it because they can't get it. So it's just an unfortunate state, and the world, we're not done yet, and hopefully we'll get to a point of stability, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. So anyway, that's kind of how the COVID situation played out for us.
What have you felt that you have learned or realized most since the pandemic, as so many things have changed? We had still ongoing conversations about Black Lives Matter and the incident that caused it, and the racial like segregations and how things have changed. Can you share some of the stories or some of the reflections behind these events?
Yeah, at least for me and my family, and I guess most of the people I interact with, we've been very blessed and fortunate that we have not been on the receiving end of violence or anger because of the pandemic. Obviously, we know where ground zero is or was, with the pandemic in China, and in the news, obviously all over in the city here and in the nation, where it's all the backlash, right, against Asian people and against Chinese people. It was extremely sad and very, at times scary to see that people have that level of misunderstanding, and I'll say it, ignorance, and trying to blame people here for what happened, and started over there. And even then, not blaming some of the people over there just has no bearing, and just people just need something to lash out at, and of course playing into Black Lives Matter, about how to some extent I saw it, and I know this is a very weird thing to say or a very kind of convoluted thing, but the pandemic in some sense I think has precipitated Chinese Americans in particular, who tend to be very quiet, very reticent about their speaking their piece, their emotions, the political, being involved in political awareness, voicing their opinions. And don't get me wrong, there are people, obviously, like my uncle is a good one. Certainly he is involved in those community awareness and political arenas. But for the most part, I think Chinese and Chinese Americans tend to be very quiet, right, in that regard. Don't make waves, right? Just blend in and do what you normally do. But I think what has happened with the pandemic, it has raised people's awareness to the point where people who would not normally speak up and try to advocate for human rights, for rights of all people, not just Chinese and Asians, but all people, it's really come to bear, where I think it has done a good thing, where I think raising some of the sensitivities and awareness of the discrimination, some of the things that we as Chinese have gone through, even call it passive aggressive as well. It may not be so overt, although absolutely there's part of that, but some of the more passive, indirect things, it's raised some awareness of that. My daughter, my youngest daughter, she graduated from SMU. She minored in human rights. She actually works now. She's taking a year off before she goes to Columbia next summer or next fall. She's working for a group here in Houston called the Organization of Chinese Americans, OCA. They specialize in advocating for the Chinese community. Right now, her and her team are very much consumed with getting Chinese people to register who haven't registered to vote, right? To make sure they can have their voice heard, to educate them about the issues, what's going on with this particular candidate, what they stand for, what kind of thought processes should they go through as they decide who to vote for and how to vote. This is all part of being really an American, right? How do you can have your voice heard? And so I think some of this, when I say it's kind of weird, it's kind of a silver lining where I see the things that have happened because of the pandemic and the negative focus, if you will, on Chinese people and where it came from. I think to some degree has helped people to be more aware, and more Chinese people, right, and the Asian people, because many times Caucasians, I hate to say this, they may not be able to tell the difference between a Chinese and a Vietnamese and a Korean and a Japanese, right? So they lump us all together. So it's kind of mobilized, I think, some of the relationships between the different Asian communities, but to also raise the awareness of what it means to be Chinese. Not to ask for special treatment, but to ask for fair treatment, right? That's what it comes down to. And I think, in some degree, that's the pandemic has helped to do that. The world will never be the same because of the pandemic, and I think some of the awareness that we face has kind of happened to do that. Now, we still face, obviously, again, some of the anger and the violence that's come out. You see stuff during the news, even today. There was a story a couple of days ago where an elderly Chinese woman was beaten. Fortunately, she didn't die, but she was violently beaten by a non-Chinese person, and under the guise of the pandemic. Maybe the person lost his job or lost a loved one to COVID, right? And they take it out on the first Chinese person they see. Sad but true, and that's the kind of things that we have to deal with, in the community. And so, having to treat the people with respect, but yet you can't have a tolerance for that, right? You can't let that go on. How do you maintain that and do that in a peaceful manner? I think it's helped the Chinese people understand what's in front of us, and we can't expect anyone else to be an advocate for us but ourselves, and that's what we have to do in the right context. So,
Thank you for sharing. And next, as we are approaching the end of the interview,
okay.
as we're taking up a lot of your time, up to 1.5 hours now.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I tend to get going when I talk, so my apologies for being lengthy in my responses sometimes.
No, thank you for your time. Do you have any stories that you would like to share regarding CACA, another community that you mentioned previously?
Oh, well, for CACA, and actually I was involved in another organization called the Houston Young Chinese American Council. I was actually president for a few years. I think, admittedly, as I go through and recall some of the things we did, it was really mainly social under the guise of doing community outreach. There are times when we would partner with touring groups that would come to the US and particularly Houston. Our sister city, if you will, is Taipei. And so they would send over performers to do certain shows and things like that. And we help host them and we'd help to, show them around the city. So it's kind of like being a good host, if you will. But admittedly, we probably didn't do as much community interaction and outreach as I thought I would have liked when I look back on things. Same thing with the CACA. I think it was a opportunity for the Chinese to bond together. Back then there wasn't much there outside of the job, and of course you're in your own business. And of course religion wasn't as mature or prominent as it is today. In the Chinese community in terms of opportunities. So the CACA, I think, was an opportunity for the Chinese to be together, to bond, to have strength in that regard. And I think that's kind of the thing that probably met its purpose. And honestly, CACA, I'm not sure if it has the notoriety or influence that it did back then, because there's so many different other organizations and opportunities that people, particularly as, again, the Chinese people become more westernized and Americanized, they want to, I think, hold on to their Chinese culture and their history, but they also understand the importance of integrating and assimilating into the American culture if this is what they're going to be their home. So how do you balance that, right? I think of many Chinese people, my daughters, a good example. How do you find that right balance between holding on to and celebrating your heritage and your culture, but yet doing what you need to do to become an American, if you will, and to integrate into American society and culture? So, back then, I think it met its purpose, socialization, providing a sanctuary, an assimilation, a bonding, if you will, for Chinese people. Just like the HYCAC, the organization that I was president of for a while. My uncle, by the way, was involved with that, my Uncle Edward. But today, I just don't see it as much of a focus as it was in the past, at least in that regard. But I'm sure there are many organizations that certainly have some of that bonding. But again, there's lots more demands for people's time and mind share, right? What their attention can get drawn to. And back then, of course, we didn't have the internet. There wasn't a lot of the social media. So, of course, all you had to do was get together in person. And today, I think it's much different, and it's a different approach, to be able to accomplish some of the same things.
Thank you so much. And at the end of the interview, would you like to leave a message for your future descendants and later generations, if you like?
Oh, okay. So I guess here's the motivational speech. I think I would leave for my kids, my grandkids, if my daughters have kids, my legacy, if you will, that it is always of value, and there's always going to be something that you can treasure and gain from remembering your Chinese culture and your history and background. I think be careful to not let it cloud your thinking, not let it drive you to decisions or interaction that would be unhealthy, but certainly being from the Chinese culture and heritage, there are absolutely things that we should be proud of, things that we should celebrate, things that we should acknowledge, and frankly, use to our advantage if the opportunity presents itself in a ethical manner, of course. But do not underestimate the importance of also assimilating into the culture and the environment in which you live, whether that's here in the US, whether that's somewhere else besides a Chinese-speaking country. You need to be able to adapt and adjust. I think that's one thing that I've noticed that Chinese people in Houston have been adept at, is assimilating in, even though they still tend to be isolationist. Being part of society, if you will, it has been one of their strong suits. So I would encourage, my legacy to continue to do the same. Hang on to your heritage, celebrate it, but don't let it rule you or consume you. I would advocate, certainly learn the language if you can. Take time to learn and become proficient in the language. You won't regret it. In the world environment we're in, being multilingual, and not just bilingual, but multilingual, can only serve you well, and being able to do it. It's one thing that I regret in my life that I haven't done is become proficient in another language, whether it's Chinese, Spanish. I'm actually more fluent in Spanish than I am Chinese, honestly. But regardless, some aspect of your culture, like the language, is going to be something that you will definitely value as you go forward. So anyway, that's one of the things that I would leave.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Shen, for your time and for your stories. And we're
Mhm.
very honored to have your interview and along with your family archive of at your uncle and aunts Edward and Eugenia Shen with us.
Mhm. 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 For sure. For sure. Glad to do it.